you could introduce yourself and your agency.
Hi, I'm Denise Beltran. I work in Adams County. I'm the traffic engineer.
All right, for those of you who just joined, we're doing introductions really quick. Just name and agency, and we're starting with folks from the Adams County portion of the region. So if you work in Adams County, if you go ahead and state your name and your agency. All right, we got some shy folks, but hopefully everybody will warm up. What about the Boulder County part of the region?
I can go.
I can go,
ahead.
but I don't work for government. My name's Matt Mueller. I work on policy for a nonprofit whose mission has to do with safer and better cycling in Boulder County.
Hi, Lizzie O'Many, Vision Zero Coordinator in Longmont.
Alexandra Phillips, the bike planner for Boulder County.
All right, thank you. Folks from the Arapahoe County part of the region. If you work in Arapahoe County, just go ahead and state your name and your agency.
Tom Walker Braddock, Senior Transportation Planner for City of Aurora, which is in both Adams and Arapahoe, but most of it's in Arapahoe.
Hey everyone, good morning. My name is Ari Snow and I'm a planner for the City of Sheridan.
Morning, everyone. I'm Thomas Shaw, Traffic Engineering Manager with the City of Englewood.
Great. What about?
One last, sorry.
Yeah.
Hi, Emily, with the City of Littleton.
Hi, Emily. All right, anybody else? Okay, let's go with Broomfield. Anybody here from Broomfield?
Good morning, Allison Baxter, Senior Transportation Planner with the City and County of Broomfield.
Hi, Allison. Let's see, alphabetical order. Is there anybody here from Clear Creek or Gilpin County? Just taking care of the rural ones really fast. No? Okay. What about Denver County?
Hey guys, John Johnson, Principal City Planner here for the Vision Zero program with the City and County of Denver.
Okay, great. What about alphabetical order? So hopefully I don't forget anybody. What about Douglas County?
Hi everyone, I'm Jenna. I'm the traffic analyst for Town of Castle Rock.
Larry Nimmo, Public Works Director, City of Castle Pines.
All right, thank you. Let's see, Jefferson County.
Good morning. It's Marnie Ratzel with Jefferson County Transportation and Engineering, working on Vision Zero here, our safety action plan.
Hi, Daniel Martinez with the City of Wheatridge, CIP Manager.
Great. And any other, let's see, Weld County?
Morning, everyone. Denise Staley, Transportation Planner for Weld County Public Works.
And now let's move on to folks from the state. How about CDOT?
Hi, Sanjeev Gupta. I'm with CDOT Headquarters Traffic and Safety.
Good morning, Melody Clayton, also with CDOT Headquarters Traffic and Safety.
Erica DeBrey, CDOT Headquarters Highway Safety Office.
Tamara Rollison, Traffic Safety Communications Manager with the CDOT headquarters.
Awesome. Any other like government agencies like RTD or CDPHE?
Hi, Director Brett Pagliari, RTD District M.
All right, anybody else that we might have missed?
Yeah, Carl
Charlie
Packer,
Ham.
Arapahoe County Traffic Engineer.
Charlie Hamble, FHWA Safety and Operations Specialist.
Daryl Alston, Traffic Engineer, City of Thornton.
Carlos Boteo, Civil Engineer, City of Thornton.
Sydney Proven, Transportation Planner with Fair and Pierce.
Michelle Molinakis, Transportation Engineer for City of Lafayette.
Kyle Cameron, Lakewood Transportation Engineering.
And Mike King, Project Manager for Atkins Rouse.
Key Late, Multimodal Liaison for CDOT.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being here. We've got a great group today, and I always love hearing the diversity of backgrounds and perspectives that attend this meeting. So thank you all for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen now so we can get rolling with our discussion topics. And then Eric's going to be monitoring the chat and any raised hands that might come up. So we covered welcome and introductions. Next, we're going to be talking about the draft regional hydro network and the types of comments that have been received so far and responses to some of them and themes, and discussing any other outstanding kind of general comments. Next, moving on to a critical corridors discussion, which is also part of our minor update to our Regional Vision Zero plan. And then Eric's going to give an overview of Safe Streets and Roads for All, in particular, the feedback that we got from FHWA or USDOT on our regional application, and then some highlights that he's seen so far for this 2026 call for projects. Then we're going to open it up to local and regional and state news and updates, anything that you have to share that you think might be of interest to others on this call. Our next meeting is going to be June 9th, so in 2 months, and it's going to be another virtual meeting, and then that will conclude the meeting. So first topic of discussion is comments on the draft regional hydro network. And I wanted to first start by saying that I've extended the deadline for comments to this Friday. So if you hadn't had a chance to get them in, here's the link. I think Eric's going to drop that link in the chat for you all to have it handy. But I know some folks needed a little bit more time, and so I just thought I'd extend it to everybody. I should have known. This always happens. So, you know, we account for these things. But I wanted to talk about some of the general feedback we've received so far. So examples of questions and comments that I've been hearing are, you know, does the draft regional hydro network need to match our local hydro network exactly? Will the regional hydro network be a criteria for funding? Are there a general comment saying, you know, there are too many lines for it to be useful as a planning tool or a prioritization tool? Other comments saying there are not enough lines in rural areas. Questions about why are there routes on the current regional hydro network that are missing from the draft one? Comments saying, you know, it's too segmented. Others saying, you know, it's not as segmented as our local plan. Other questions about funding, like does the entire corridor need to be on the hydro network to be eligible for funding? And so I wanted to talk through some of these comments and respond to them where I can, and open it up for general discussion as well. So first, going just a general overview of what is DRCOG's hydro network and what do we use it for? What can it be used for? So it identifies the roads with the highest concentrations of fatal and serious injury crashes. This can help us prioritize resources to get to zero by focusing on those locations with the most fatal and serious injury crashes. It's generally used to help inform our safety planning work. It has been used as a consideration when evaluating projects, for example, for funding, but I did want to note that the TIP policy is currently under review. And so how the HIN is used for project review, as well as what safety criteria are used for evaluating projects, is currently up for discussion. So that is not definitive. I think the hydro network is also a tool for bringing attention to corridors that should be a priority at a regional level. As we all know, most people don't experience transportation at a jurisdictional boundary level. They cross jurisdictional lines every single day. They usually don't know when they do. And so that's why a regional approach to transportation is very beneficial. It identifies crash hotspots for local governments that lack their own safety plan. So if you don't have your own, you can use the Regional Hydro Network not only as support for grant applications, but also to identify hotspots, routes on the Hydro Network in your jurisdiction, as well as looking at our regional crash profiles to see what kinds of issues are priorities for being addressed. So things like left turn crashes and speeding and things like that. And as I mentioned, it can support grant applications. So I wanted to go through, in response to some of those questions and comments that were raised, the current hydro network versus the draft hydro network. So where we have been versus where we are right now, talk through some of the similarities and some of the differences. So for example, looking at the percent of fatal and serious injury crashes that are captured per road mile captured, it's the current draft network is fairly similar. So both of them are 9% of the regional road miles in the Denver region. This network, the draft network, captures slightly more fatal and serious injury crashes as a percentage, but it's still very similar. 77% are captured by the current draft hydro network versus 75% by the 2020 hydro network. We did use a different crash data set to create this one. We included minor injury, pedestrian and bicycle crashes, as well as fatal and serious injury crashes for all modes. That was intended to help better align with methodologies of many local agencies and came out of our discussions at the October working group meeting. But as you can see, it didn't skew the results significantly. We're still capturing about even more KSI crashes than we were before. A threshold for selecting corridors to be on the hydro network. So previously they used 3 crashes per mile, so a higher threshold. This time around we used 2 crashes per mile as a threshold. That came out of the February working group meeting, the 2 crashes per mile threshold. But it's interesting to know that while we have a lower threshold, which you would think would make it less efficient, because just more corridors are getting in, it still resulted in about the same percentage of road miles and even more KSI crashes captured. I think the reason for that is because the previous network really focused on longer routes, closing gaps. So there wasn't a distance defined for gaps to be closed. You can kind of just tell that if you look at the previous versus the current one, versus we focused on closing gaps if they were within a half a mile only. The current 2020 version removed isolated segments. This current version, we kept isolated segments. So there could be a half-mile segment out in the hills or the mountains in this current one that you wouldn't see that you would see there in the draft version that you wouldn't see in the current version. And then finally, both of them include limited access highways. There was a lot of concern about if that would skew funding, and for DRCOG's purposes, it hasn't skewed funding in the past, and I don't expect it to skew funding in the future. But it does seem important and relevant to highlight limited access highways as, again, most people experience transportation not from a jurisdictional level or a ownership level, but just an overall regional level. So to summarize, the draft Hydra network captures more KSI crashes, just slightly, in the same total roadway mileage. So the point is it's very similar, at least from a metric standpoint. It is intended to better align with the methodologies of many local agencies' Hydra networks, but it's important to note that there's about 1,000 ways that you can create a Hydra network, so it's never going to align with everybody's. It could be considered, yeah.
Sorry, I do have a quick question just about, is that 9% of road miles for all functional classifications?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. In creating it, we excluded local roads, but that total road mileage does include local roads. Sorry, I have to blow my nose. Okay, so the draft network could be considered more piecemeal, but it could arguably also be called more targeted. And then it does have more local rural road segments than the 2020 Hydra network. A lot of, I think that space, that mileage was freed up. There's a lot of continuous stretches in the 2020 version on highways. And so some of that was broken up into more targeted sections, and therefore that mileage was able to be distributed to more kind of targeted segments throughout the region. So the focus of this draft Hydra network review is intended to be on identifying if there are any glaring absences that you see as you quickly review it. So for example, are there high priority corridors in your local plan that are missing? For Denver, that would probably be, federal. If federal wasn't on there, that would be a glaring issue. Are there locations of known fatal or serious crash hotspots that we just missed or that the methodology just missed? They shouldn't have been missed by our methodology, and we also did a manual review, but there have been a couple locations where it met the threshold and it just wasn't picked up for one reason or another. So, for example, Daryl had identified a location at some on and off ramps of 470 where there were 2 KSI crashes. There was actually another one on the adjacent ramp that was misplaced. So really it was 3 KSI crashes. So that should have been picked up and would be added. And then finally, are there locations that were on the current 2020 Hydra network where you anticipate requesting funding and for one reason or another, they weren't on there. So, or just they were a current corridor or priority for the city. So I'll get into an example of that in just a minute. But I still wanted to note that all requests for additional routes must meet the minimum threshold of at least 2 crashes of interest per mile. And then addressing the question about, does the regional Hydra network need to match your local HIN exactly? And the answer to that is no. I think it's important that there not be high priority discrepancies, but it doesn't need to match exactly. And actually, Liz and I were talking last week, and there could be some benefit to them not overlapping perfectly because it could provide you with more options in the event of a grant application. Basically, you're getting more coverage on your network. So there could be some benefits for you locally of them not matching perfectly. But we do want to make sure that there aren't critical high priority corridors that are missing from the regional Hydra network.
Catherine, before next slide, I want to know Tom has his hand up. Do you have a question, Tom, at this point?
Yeah, thank you, Eric and Catherine. I may have missed this when I was taking notes. Can you go over the reason for lowering the threshold from 3 to 2? The other changes of old versus new seems to make sense, but that one, it seems to have a broader impact.
Yeah. So the intent was basically just to allow more routes to be on the Hydra network, particularly in rural areas that might otherwise be excluded from the Hydra network, and just to be more useful for local agencies that didn't have their own local plan. We wanted to give them more routes with which to use and plan from.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so I wanted to go through examples of a couple comments that I've discussed with folks that make sense and I think provide illustrations of the types of comments that would be appropriate. So the first one is Miramonte Boulevard in Broomfield. The dark blue is the draft Hindry network, and the pink is the current 2020 Hindry network. And so let's look at that intersection on the left. I don't know if you can you see my mouse, Eric?
Yes.
Okay, great. So the way that our current methodology assigned crashes to intersections was based on the on-road, whatever, for traffic unit 1, as well as the travel direction. I think we might reconsider that methodology in the future, but for this purposes, I think it was fine, especially once we coupled it with our manual review and your manual review. However, it did result in a condition like this example on the left, where this road segment doesn't have any other crashes except for the ones identified at this intersection. And Broomfield let us know, hey, this Miramonte Boulevard was on the last Hindry network. We have been doing a corridor study for it. You know, we think this is a priority to be on there. Our main emphasis is that basically these crashes get captured. So if we want to move this route, like delete this route because they said it's not a priority for them, and move it to this route here, where we would actually capture an additional crash, that would make sense. But that's kind of a local comment that we just wouldn't know that this is a priority. But the point is still to be capturing the critical captures that the critical crashes that this route captures. The next one is an example from Pleasant Park Road in Jefferson County, up in the mountains. And for one, as you can see, part of it was on the previous Hindry network. And for one reason or another, it wasn't, our coding did not result in it being a route. These crashes are about 1 mile apart. And I think that was probably it, but there's 5 motorcycle crashes. I think there's 3 right there, 2 there up in the mountains. And so once you combine them into a 1 mile segment, it certainly meets the threshold. And so this is another location that in our manual review we missed. I think it just kind of just fell out of the bounds barely of our coding methodology, our automated network development, but it still makes sense to include it in the Hindry network. So this is another example of a route that would make sense to add. Okay, so now I just wanted to open it up to other general questions and comments. We're going to get into critical corridors in a second. So I think the comments about about having too many routes for it to be useful, I think could be addressed there. But I wanted to open it up for other general feedback and questions.
So
okay. Oh yeah, go ahead.
I'm curious about the actual analysis process and how replicable this is for local agencies if they wanted to be consistent with so we're updating our transportation master plan starting soon, and so Hindry network analysis is going to be one of those things. If we wanted to be consistent, is the analysis that was done here a fairly replicable one for medium to smaller agencies?
Yes. Yes. One thing, the short answer is yes, with a caveat, but it's all, we tried to code and automate as much of the development as possible. I think there's a couple tweaks that we would go back and make, but the intent was for it to be as automated and replicable as possible. So yes, the caveat is that we learned that we use the sliding windows tool, which makes sense when your roadway network in GIS is longer routes, because basically, if you just did a simple join, you wouldn't be able, it would just join to an entire long route versus using a sliding windows helps us prioritize, specific parts of a long route. It doesn't work as well, or it doesn't make as much sense in areas where you have shorter routes. So if your local road network is like block by block by block in GIS, then it might not make as much sense unless you wanted to join them together for the purposes of the sliding windows analysis. So it is replicable, but it's a little bit of which technical route you go sort of, I think, depends on the state of your, like how your road network is set up.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Sorry, I've got construction happening back here.
Yeah, Liv.
Yeah, thank you. Can you talk a little bit more about your approach to segments versus intersections? Because, for example, I'm thinking of a corridor in the county where if you look at the crashes, they're isolated really at the intersections, and there are several of them, but they're not getting counted. They're not on the network at all. So I was just curious to learn a little bit more about your approach and thoughts on that.
Yeah, so in general, we had a conversation early on about whether or not we wanted to have like a high injury intersections layer as well. We ultimately decided to focus on corridors because that's how DRCOG more often funds projects. I think we don't fund as many intersection specific projects as we do corridor projects, and the intersections, except for in those isolated cases, would still often be picked up by a corridor. But that was the justification for that, was trying to match this prioritization tool with our typical with how we typically use it, at least for funding purposes.
Okay. I may have some more specific questions to follow up on then.
Yeah. And then going back to the actual methodology, that was another one that we spent a lot of time on, and I think we might in a future iteration, we might revisit a little bit. I don't think it impacts things enough, again, to warrant like going back, but it's something that, wanting to constantly improve and refine, I think that could be something that we go back and look at. But the way we did it was, rather than assigning crashes at intersections to all of the adjacent street segments, we assigned it to the street segment that was the on-road in the crash report, and then based which side of the intersection on the travel direction of traffic unit 1. So if they were traveling east, we would assign it actually to the west side of the intersection, if that makes sense, because they would be on the west side.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Catherine, do you have a question in the chat from Director Pagliari? What was the rationale for limiting vulnerable road user deaths to years 2020 through 2024 and not including older injuries and deaths?
Yeah, so, 5 years of crash data is typical for high injury networks and these types of analysis. There was a change to the crash form in 2018 through 2020, even still 2021. And I think the kind of decision was that our GIS data wasn't as high or our crash data wasn't as high of quality pre-2020, and there was a lot of differences in the crash data as well that made it a little bit challenging for us to use prior years. So it's a little bit of twofold. It's partially because we wanted to just use 5 years of data, and then partially just thinking about what data we felt had the best quality. And we did look at some locations to see if we felt like there were big differences in the locations of 2020 crashes. I know that that's a concern. And it was for us as well, about did COVID skew it? And we know COVID skewed crashes. But looking at the locations for some areas, again, we just did a sample, it looked like it didn't have as big of an impact as it looked somewhat consistent with subsequent years. That's what I'm trying to say. All right, anything else before we keep moving? Okay, next up is critical corridors. So, and the kind of question here is, do we need a second level of prioritization? So I think this gets at that question, that comment about, are there too many routes in the draft Hindray network for it to actually be useful as a regional prioritization tool if so many streets are on the Hindray network? So what we call critical corridors are this kind of like second level of prioritization, and they are in the current version of taking action on Regional Vision Zero. And so in the current plan, it's 1.5% of road miles that counted for 32% of fatal and serious injury crashes. So thinking about what the purpose of a second level of prioritization could be, it could be used to help bring attention to corridors that are particularly high injury. So ones that we want to ensure get addressed sooner rather than later in order to make notable progress in advancing Regional Vision Zero goals. It could, emphasis on the could, be another consideration when scoring tip and set aside projects. Emphasis on could there. And then it could be used when discussing work plans and priorities with CDOT, just knowing that, you know, no city has the capacity or agency has the capacity to address all of these roads in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And so where should they start? Where should they make sure to focus their efforts? So with the current critical corridors, there's a little bit of confusion about the methodology used to create them. You know, there's a little bit of difference between the documentation and what's in the plan and what one person tells me versus another person tells me how it was developed. So I kind of want to start a little bit fresh on that. And so I have 4 options of methodologies for identifying critical corridors for you to consider. Now, there could also be a 5th option, which is do nothing. We don't need critical corridors. And then you might propose a hybrid of one of the options or an alternative method. So here are the 4 options, at least to kick off discussion for you to consider. So the first option would be what I'm calling a regional approach. So this is the top 20% of routes in the region based on crashes of interest per mile and a route's just raw count of crashes of interest. The purpose of having both metrics was to address the issue of very small segments having a very high crashes of interest per mile, and therefore kind of skewing the results a bit. So we wanted to look at which routes captured the most total crashes of interest, as well as had the greatest density of crashes of interest per mile. So again, a route had to meet both of those criteria and be in the top 20% of routes to be on this map. Now, thinking about pros and cons from a Regional Vision Zero perspective of focusing on purely those routes that account for the highest numbers of fatal and serious injury crashes, this would most meet those goals. However, it would be less useful for identifying priorities at a county level. As you can see, many counties there are a handful of counties that are left off and don't really have any critical corridors. And it would also make it less useful for identifying priorities for local safety planning. Okay, so that's number 1, regional approach. Number 2, so I'm going to go through these and then summarize them. Option 2 is what I'm calling an equal county approach. So this is it maps the top 10 routes in each county based on crashes of interest per mile. I wanted to note that Gilpin only has 5 routes on the Hindray network, on the draft Hindray network currently, and so it just has 5. But based on comments, you know, if we were to add more routes to Gilpin, then it would go up to 10. Now, I did differ a little bit on thresholds for mileage. So in urban and suburban counties, routes had to be at least a mile long. Again, that was to address the issue of really short routes having a disproportionately high crashes per mile and kind of skewing results. But in rural counties, knowing that they just don't have as many routes on the Hindry network, routes just had to be at least a half-mile long. So rural counties included Clear Creek, Gilpin, and Weld, and I think Broomfield as well. So just those small counties that didn't have as many routes on the Hindry network. That's option 2, equal county approach. Next up is option 3. So this was based on the county's percent of the region's fatal and serious injury crashes. So the number of routes allotted to each county is based on their share of the region's KSI crashes. So for example, Adams County from 2020 to 2024 accounted for 18% of the region's KSI crashes, and so they were allotted 16 or 18 corridors. And similar to option 2, those corridors were selected based on which had the top crashes of interest per mile, and also used, similar to option 2, also had a similar mileage threshold for urban and suburban counties. So again, for urban and suburban, they had to be at least a mile long. And then for those rural counties with fewer corridors, it had to just be at least a half-mile long. So this was intended to strike another balance of taking a data-driven regional approach to focusing on the routes with the highest fatal and serious injury crashes while ensuring at least a minimum level of distribution amongst counties. So that's option 3, based on the county's percent of KSI. Next up is option 4. For this option, we allotted routes to counties based on the methodology that was used in the Regional Transportation Plan for nominating projects. So for the RTP, Adams County was allowed to submit up to 15 projects. So in this case, we allotted 15 corridors to Adams County. And similar with options 3 and 2, the routes for each county were based off of which routes had the top crashes of interest per mile, and we also used the same mileage thresholds. So this one is intended to still provide a little bit greater. It's intended to provide a little bit greater county distribution than option 3. So for example, in option 3, Weld County only had 1 crash of interest allotment versus in this option, they have 5 crashes of interest allotment. Now, these allotments per county are fairly similar to the KSI in option 3. The differences are that Adams and Arapahoe, their allotments are in some way flipped. Adams County in the previous option had a higher allotment, and Arapahoe County had less. In this one, it was flipped. And then Denver has about 4 fewer allotments. Now, I will say that the total, if you just looked at the total number of routes identified in these options, it would be less than if you added up these various county allotments. And that's because a handful of these routes overlapped and were identified as priorities for multiple counties. So for example, Colfax would be identified as a critical corridor in 4 counties. Sheridan would be a critical corridor in 2 counties. So there's a couple like that. Okay, so to summarize, option 1, which has a then total of 110 critical corridor routes out of I think 460, Um, this option best identifies highest priority corridors from a regional perspective, but it leaves out rural counties. Option 2 includes all counties. So there are critical corridor routes in all counties, and it could help identify priorities at a county level, but it could take away attention from the region's highest injury corridors. Option 3, which has 88 routes, provides more distribution across counties than option 1, while still taking a data-driven regional approach. But many rural counties still only have one critical corridor, which could reduce the usefulness for county level planning. And then finally, option 4, which allots critical corridor routes based on the regional transportation plan methodology, provides more distribution across counties than options 1 and 3, while still taking a data-driven regional approach. I forgot to mention the methodology used for the regional transportation plan allotment, and it was based off of population, employment, and vehicle miles traveled was used to determine the allotment for the regional transportation plan. And then the cons are Denver and Adams County are potentially disadvantaged by getting fewer routes than other options. Okay, so I have a survey for you to take. If you would like to consult others at your agency before you take it, or have others at your agency take it, I'm asking if you could fill out this survey by Friday and tell us which option you like best, keeping in mind that it could be, there is an other option in there. So if you think this is not needed, or if you are wanting to propose a hybrid option, you can click other, and then there's a general text box at the bottom where you can give us feedback. Now you might be wondering, well, can we look at these routes in detail? Won't they change based off of comments? You can look at them. I would say that they could change a little bit based off of comments, though ideally, hopefully, if our methodology was good, that these critical corridors should be have been identified on the high injury network. And so comments that we receive shouldn't impact it too much. Yeah, so keep that in mind, that it could change a little bit, but it isn't likely to change a lot. So if you do notice things for your county that you want to comment on related to specific routes, you can do that as well in the comment box. Okay, with that, I'm going to open it up to questions and feedback. I know I just gave you a lot to think about, so what are your thoughts?
Yep. We do have one question in the chat already, coming from Tom against the Aurora. Does option 1 most closely match the current critical corridor approach?
The current critical, no, the current critical corridors, it was intended to provide more distribution amongst counties. I do know that. I don't know that it was the exact same amongst, and it was pretty, I think option 2 might be closer.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Oh, here, I'll go back to.
And Tom, just follow up.
Thanks for that clarification, Catherine and Eric. I know with the previous or current Vision Zero high injury network, it took me a little bit to understand the difference between high injury network and critical corridors. But once I did, the 1.5% of the roadway miles that account for over 30% of KSI, that's a pretty powerful statement and pretty powerful need for addressing that relatively small segment of corridors. Seems like a lot of return on investment for that. Really concerned about option 4, simply because that doesn't seem to address the underlying focus of this group, which is looking at the best options for addressing crashes on a regional effort, allocating critical corridor assignment based purely off of the numbers of employees and residents in a county. that seems to be a little bit silent towards, or maybe not silent, but subdues the impact of crashes. So my 2 cents.
I think I saw Michelle. Did you have your hand up?
Yeah, can you hear me okay, Catherine?
Mhm.
I guess my primary question is like, what the intended use of this is? So I think there's benefits to multiple approaches. So even being in a rural county, I can see the benefit in having the critical counties when you look holistically at the whole corridor. But I can also see significant benefit in having the priorities set for each one of the counties, especially when we're looking at sub-regional forums and tip calls and things like that. Is there a possibility of having multiples of these for different purposes set out in the report? Let me know if that question makes sense too.
I mean, anything's possible. My only concern that it would just add a little bit confusion, as Tom said, it took a long time for him to figure out critical corridors with just one approach. And so I would be concerned that having multiples of them could add confusion, and therefore people would be less likely to refer to it at all. But certainly anything's possible. Yeah.
I'm also curious what the purpose or what the intended purpose is.
I think it's to highlight, there's so many routes on the high injury network that I think like the really high injury network streets could get lost. And so it's intended to just basically provide a second level of prioritization to help figure out, okay, which of these hundreds of high injury network routes are actually the top of the top? Which ones do we need to, especially from a DRCOG perspective, really try to be pushing and pursuing over the next 5-10 years, or just monitoring in the case of parts of Colfax, to ensure we make progress on reducing fatalities and serious injuries.
Sorry, just follow up. It will be used for funding, I guess, like, to be blunt, like, if it's used for funding option 1, Denver's going to get all the money, and if it's, option 2, then it's, what I mean, it's more spread out. Just curious.
It could be, as I mentioned before, the TIP policy is still very much under discussion and will be discussed this year. I think you're right that there would be concerns depending on which option was picked if it was then used for funding. But it could be, or it could be, as I mentioned before, just looking at, coordinating with agencies, particularly, CDOT, when discussions are had about like regional priorities versus CDOT priorities, having a more tailored list of safety corridors could help with those discussions, sort of separate, but also thinking about funding.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah. All right, I saw some other hands. Who's next?
It's like Stephen.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, I guess my question was very similar to what Eric Stein was just touching on. It would be good before voting on which is our preferred option to understand whether or not these critical corridors, which are a subset of all the high injury network, will be used in funding allocation decisions, and if it will be, like, to what extent, like, would it be used instead of or in addition to the high injury network, which is all the places where there's the threshold of 2 injuries per mile, but inclusive of those places that are not as severe as this critical corridor network. Yeah, I think it comes down to funding for us, and just I would want to understand that better to help inform our decision.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if it was to be used for funding, and that's a big if, I don't see it replacing the hydro network. It would be probably a supplemental, but again, that is very much under discussion. And so if that seems like, then it would be problematic for you to vote on one of these options, then I think you should take that into consideration, just thinking about all the different uses, both at a regional level and local level for these critical corridor options.
Okay, thanks. And yeah, I'll note too, it's just interesting to me to observe, since the county is going through our own safety plan right now, at least for our unincorporated areas. Yeah, I guess the methodologies that even like give like a greater weight to a county unto itself, at least in our case, still seem to concentrate the critical corridors in specific geographic areas of the county. When I think some of the data we've seen in our study is that we have corridors that are coming out as our top priorities that are in other places anyways. So I don't know. Yeah, the data is just interesting and surprising to me in that way as well. I'll leave it at that.
I feel like it'd be interesting to have a unincorporated counties safety planning workshop to hear everybody's different approaches to it. Originally, we were hoping to be able to do which I'll talk about in next steps, hoping to do like a high risk kind of systemic analysis, focusing on some of the crash profiles, such as, fixed object or runoff road crashes, which are very prevalent in rural areas. Currently, it doesn't seem like we have all the data in place to be able to do that. So we might be developing more of a work plan to do that in the future. But I could see an analysis like that being used to identify priority locations for improvements for more rural areas that just don't have as high of crash history, but still have safety issues. So I think we do recognize that these rural areas are unique and still have their own challenges, but just don't have as much of the crash hotspots as our more suburban and urban areas.
Yeah, you've got it, I guess, right? Like with Arapahoe County, we're not Gilpin County where we're entirely rural, but we have issues in our rural areas, and of course those are just kind of totally drowned out by the urban areas in whatever of these four methodologies, which does make sense, but maybe has ramifications for us.
Yeah.
Well, all right, got several hands up. I think next we'll go to Emily, If City of Littleton.
Thanks, Eric. I was wondering, I guess we're kind of a little too far in the process now to have thought about this, but like if there was ever a consideration of doing like a tiered approach, or in the same vein of like the existing regional Vision Zero, like crash types that are based on the area types, was there like a consideration of adjusting the analysis based on those area types or something like that, so that it's like we have a rural high injury network, we have a more suburban and then urban, based on those different types of context of the vehicle miles traveled and the roadways and all that stuff that we're seeing on them. I don't know, I just wonder if that was ever considered.
Yeah, so that could be like an option 5 of instead of like allotting routes by county, it would sort of be by urban, suburban, rural, interstate contexts. And it could be based off of like crashes per mile in each of those context zones.
And I mean more for the high injury network in general, like if rather than critical corridors, because even when I was in the position, I never understood the critical corridors and could really figure out like their full benefit. And to me, more having like a high injury network analysis that's been adjusted, based on the different contexts that we're seeing in those different, area types and those roadway types. Would there be like a different type of analysis that could be used on those more rural roadways that's different, and taking into account there's going to be far less that you'll see than in an urban area, and those two like it would develop 3 totally separate, like high injury networks, but could be useful to people in those jurisdictions. But just a thought.
Yeah. I wish we had this comment, a few months ago, but I think still the challenge with rural areas, even just based, if we were to use a hotspot analysis, goes back to just the lack of crashes. Right now, it's not an urban, suburban, rural thing. It's just everybody has to meet the same threshold criteria of 2 crashes per mile. And so I think, I talked to Jefferson County about this, about how we could better reflect rural areas, but I think thinking about like if we lower the crash threshold to 1, then that's every route. So that's where I really do think rural areas would benefit from a more systemic high risk style analysis to identify high priority locations, and that was something that we had hoped to do and just haven't been able to do yet.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so a few more hands. Thanks for that, Emily. Let's give the floor to Michelle, City of Lafayette.
Okay, thanks, Eric. And I guess just again, a point of clarification. So I think there's a huge importance to the critical corridors in the whole DRCOG region, but I think there's also benefit, and whether you call it the DRCOG critical corridors or the county specific critical corridors or something else, right? If we're looking at the holistic DRCOG process and all of the ways in which we can be involved, I think there is a huge benefit to knowing which roadways are sort of a scaled approach to prioritize those in the counties as well. And I hope that even if it's not in this critical corridor map, that is highlighted somewhere in the report. I think that would be, like I said, just kind of a critical thing for coordinating and regional approaches and the sub-regional forums, et cetera, et cetera. And so I don't know if it can just be provided, or like you all can just show a scale somehow of the entire high injury network that we could then use to collaborate with different agencies. So South Boulder Road, I can work with Louisville and the county, and we can kind of see which shared roadways are a priority in those rural agencies too. I hope if it doesn't come out in this map, it comes out somewhere in the report again.
Yeah. No matter what, we've throughout this process, the GIS team and I have been talking about making sure that the final high injury network map, like GIS product, comes with the information on like crashes of interest per mile, like KSI crashes per mile, and then we can add in to like a percentile or like a quintile, assignment to corridors if we wanted to. So, or just leaving it, with just those basic numbers to allow counties and jurisdictions to use it to do their own rankings as well. So no matter what, that will be a product with the high injury network GIS map.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah. All right, I think we have time for one more, and then we have to move on to Eric's presentation.
Yep. Great. And we do have one more hand up. So I'll pass the mic to Marnie, Jefferson County.
Thank you. I think Emily touched upon a lot of what I was going to say, and it is the feedback that we provided to date is that the high injury network analysis does seem to skew more toward urban than rural. So we have talked a little bit about if there's an opportunity for the high injury network, draft network, if the segmentation could be modified. That's one question. We're in the process of doing our high injury network for Jefferson County and our communities. And we did split it into the 2 contexts, with Plains, our segmentation being about a 1/4 mile was the target, with a max length of about a third of a mile. In the mountains, it was a half mile with a range to segment it out. So when I look at the high injury network, the feedback we've already provided is that some of our mountain corridors aren't appearing. It sounds like the way to address that is to go in and identify those versus potentially changing the methodology. And then seeing the options for the critical corridors today, flipping through those real quick the way that you did, even less of our rural corridors end up on there, which becomes a bit of a concern if the systemic high risk network analysis doesn't look like it's possible at this point. So, I'm more kind of noodling it all over in my head and just wanted to share that out with the group with the concerns, knowing that Gilpin and Clear Creek aren't at the table today and that they are smaller rural communities. Outreach to them on all of this, I think, is also important from an equitable standpoint. We're one of those rural community or counties that have these two different contexts, rural and urban. I don't know if you have any feedback on those comments.
Yeah, so I think it kind of just comes back to this might ring a bell to like RTD folks, but where they talk about, coverage versus ridership. It's almost like coverage. Do we want to take a coverage approach or do we want to take a focus on our highest injury corridors approach? I think there are benefits to both, but at a certain point, like either you start kind of, if you add too many routes, you start watering down the network, or you have to take away from one or the other. So I guess with that in mind, do other folks on here feel like we should take a second look at our approach to rural areas and or making sure we have, I don't know, a high risk network or something like that, or some sort of approach before moving on with this minor update?
Then I had one other comment, and that was just the overall HIN is pretty saturated. And when it goes out to the community for review, are there concerns about messaging with respect to that? That was the other one, other overarching comment that our team had. So I'll leave that with you.
Yeah, that was a great comment that you had brought up to me about, for example, Denver, you guys have done all this great work, but a lot of it's been in the past, couple of years and isn't necessarily reflected in the crash data yet. And so people might have a certain reaction to seeing certain routes on the Hydra network. And so us needing to make sure that we have messaging in order and responses to that ready. So I appreciate that comment. Okay, going back to the rural discussion, are there, I guess, I know we have to move on. So maybe if you have an opinion, if you could drop it in the chat, that would be great, just to help provide some guidance about how best to address this.
And we can also stay on a little bit longer towards the end of the meeting. So after I give the update on SS4A, we'll have the roundtable. And if there's anything we haven't addressed or you want to bring up again, I know there's a few more comments in the chat. We can certainly talk about it then too.
All right, Eric, do you want to take it over?
Yes, but first I actually want to give Byron the floor for a clarification.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Eric. And hey, everyone, I'm Byron. I'm a GIS specialist at DRCOG, and I just wanted to circle back to Emily's comment about replicability. And just wanted to kind of echo Catherine's comment that to replicate these methods, it really depends on what inputs you have available. So we used the CDOT linear referencing system as our input for the road network. And so some of our precise methods are very specific to the nature of that data. And so if you don't have access to that, and you don't have access to kind of the same coding environment, there's kind of some specifics there There are ways you could replicate it that might be more manual, that would take some of our criteria and apply them in a simpler way potentially. So just kind of wanted to mention that for folks who might be interested in replicating the methods, and I'd be happy to chat with anybody about that. But yeah, it might just be difficult to do it exactly the way we did it based on our kind of specific inputs that we used. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that before we moved on.
Right, perfect. Thanks, Byron. Right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Is everyone seeing slide up? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right, so briefly for the next 15 minutes or so, just gonna go over what we've learned about the new SS4A 2026 grant that's come out. Notice of Funding Option D came out on March 27th, and talk about the follow-up that we had with the Volpe Center, which is out of the U.S. Department of Transportation on our application from last year. So with this year's application, as mentioned, the NOFO did come out on March 27th. It is due on May 26th at 5 p.m. and all of the times that will be referenced are in Eastern time. This is different than last year and previous years. Previous cycles have had a 90-day period for the grant application. This time it is a 60-day application, so bear that in mind as you go through this process if you are interested in applying. Another thing that's changed a little bit is just the funding allocation. With this one being the last year of the program as it currently exists, there's a slightly greater emphasis on implementation grants, as we've heard from the US DOT. So I think it's a slightly larger allocation is towards the implementation side versus planning and demonstration. But the general mechanisms and sizes of funds available have remained the same. So for implementation grants, this would be between $2.5 to $25 million. This is essentially anything that is being, as the name implies, I'm implementing something from an action plan, something that's being built, something that's meant to be permanent and not like a demonstration project, which are meant to be temporary in nature, or at least made of materials that could be temporary in nature to prove project worthiness. For that other 300 million of the funding available, that is for planning and demonstration. There's still an opportunity to apply for it for planning funds. Largely those planning funds in earlier years were meant to kind of create the action plans that would set up a community to apply for SS4A for implementation, but they are still allowing and planning for quite a few of those funds to go towards planning and demonstration activities. And for those, the projected expected project range is between about $100,000 to $5 million. We've heard that, yeah, typically at least maybe 200,000, 2.5 or 250,000 or more is kind of a good number for contracting. And I know some of our local agencies have also expressed that if it's typically, maybe it's difficult or not worth the staff time and attention that goes to a federal grant if you're not in that range. But that's kind of what they're expecting, is between around 200,000, 250, but anywhere between 100,000 to 5 million is eligible for those planning and demonstration activities. They do offer, the USDOT is offering a forum for technical questions on applications that can be submitted. Those are due on April 24th, and again by 5 p.m. on that day. And there is just information in the NOFO itself about who to contact. Just a couple of changes on this year's form from last year. Again, I already noted that there's a 60-day application period instead of 90 days for prior years. So please bear that in mind. There were two priorities added to the NOFO this year. One being to whether the projects can beautify transportation infrastructure with context-appropriate design and or child-friendly elements, or also to advance eligible truck parking with clear roadway safety nexus. Those have been added as, again, just priorities that you may want to address if your project aligns with either of those. It could look favorably to reviewers. Another note on competitiveness is a mention of modernizing public safety infrastructure. This is something that was always allowed in the program, but it wasn't really explicitly laid out as clearly as in this year's NOFO. So this has been explicitly mentioned or laid out in the NOFO to mention pre-hospital blood transfusion capabilities. Some folks may be familiar with the Colorado Whole Blood Coalition. They had presented this group before. They had applied last year, and I believe they may be applying again this year. And so any other grants of that vein or improving post-crash care as a component of the safe system approach is something that is eligible. And again, it's noted directly in the NOFO that an application could be would be more competitive on those elements. One other notable change in the NOFO was a much more robust explanation of the criteria for selection. The original one just had a very simple, or the last few years had very simple charts with the different things such as safety analysis, safety impact, and whether it be high, medium, or low recommendation. This year is similar, but it's a more expanded rubric. It's much more detailed. So I would definitely take a look at that and see if your narrative, if your application is checking off the elements in those rubrics. Now onto our application from last year, just our feedback. I already shared this out to the local governments that were involved with the application last year. We had 8 local governments who submitted projects with us. We were informed that our application, while it was rated acceptable, it did not rise to being recommended or highly recommended. And only 13% of applicants were accepted or had their projects approved. We heard a few things, sometimes honestly felt a little contradictory, but with some of the things we heard about our NEPA and project readiness, and also along the lines of post-award engagement, community engagement, was that, or they could have been clearer, they could have been a little more detail on what the plans were for that engagement, and also what the status was for the projects in the pipeline. However, when we asked for specific examples, they weren't provided. It was noted that it seems like all of our projects would have been able to be completed within that 5-year period. So it's a little unclear what more they would be looking for, but just pay attention to that. If you have NEPA updates, if you have anything of that sort, it would be really great to just provide as much detail as you can on those topics. Similarly, we were informed that the budgets were not clearly articulated, but when we asked for specific examples of what might have been missing or what could have been improved, we were not provided any examples. This was a little confusing for us because in all of our projects, we did lay out different phases. I feel like we had contingency for almost all of them, or maybe for all of them. So just pay attention to that as well. Just really look at what the more you can provide, it seems, as far as the readiness, as far as the budget, that seems that is going to be favorable for reviewers. One other note too was, and this is kind of not super in anyone's control, but it was just a fact that most of the census tracts covered by our project areas were not in underserved communities, and the way that the administration is defining this is basically focusing on areas of persistent poverty, and there's a specific methodology that was developed for that. And with that, only 4 of the 29 census tracts fell in those areas. A few other comments we received, these were not necessarily about our application specifically, but just things that could be useful going forward in this next year's application for governments who are intending to apply, are to, if you can, include that highway safety manual style crash reduction analysis to truly demonstrate that safety impact. In our application, we had included the total number of KSI crashes for each project. We had included the type of countermeasures that will be employed, including their crash reduction factors. But they really want, it sounds like they really want governments to kind of take even further steps to develop, do the calculations, for them, going through with those volumes, if you have them, going through that empirical Bayes process to do that, again, the Highway Safety Manual Part C analysis. The more you can do, the more local governments can do to put the numbers in front of the reviewers, I think the better your chances are to be seen favorably. Another thing in how writing the narrative, they were explicitly told that we should in the future try to include more of this administration's priorities, looking at to the text of the NOFO, any relevant executive orders and department USDOT memos, keep and working those into the narrative as appropriate. Speaking of the narrative as well, having, and this relates, speaking of the narrative and the budget, all of these projects do require a 20% local match, and we were told that it would be beneficial to clearly state in the narrative where that funding is coming from. All of our projects did have committed local match as required, but I believe we had a lot of information where that was coming from in the cut sheets that had more detail on the projects themselves, and also in the letters of support from whether they were from the local government itself or some of the local match was coming from state funds that was expressed in letters of support. So just putting in the narrative, putting everything out as clearly as possible. In that same vein, if you look through the order of things in the narrative or the NOFO itself, just following them as closely as you can. So matching the order information, looking at the scoring criteria, following that. They're expecting, I think they received over 900 applications last year, or well over 900, over 1,000 applications. So the most we can do, or most you can do to make yours rise to the top, make it be legible, understandable, the better. Two final things about the narrative are when you have your post-award and community engagement, include those planned actions so that it's clear that that's being thought of, that it's part of it. We were informed that in our application last year that it was clear that we had done a lot of engagement with local governments, and our local governments had done a lot of engagement with their constituents to develop the projects themselves. They felt that the post-award engagement was perhaps weak or not explained clearly enough. And then finally, including a detailed demographic analysis, including projected trends in your communities, is something that the administration is looking for. Again, with this, we had included things such as the population of each of the local of the governments involved, of the census blocks, the median income, levels of percent poverty. It seems like they are expecting more than that. So again, while they didn't provide exactly what should be included, just do what you can to work that information in. In addition to this debrief we had from the Volpe Center, USDOT did have a webinar just last week that was about the implementation grants. And one of the things that they brought up in that was checking if you're intending to apply, make sure that your agency has valid eval access. Valid eval is a system used by DOT and probably some other federal agencies for things such as these applications, these grant applications. You likely have access if your agency has applied for federal funds directly before, but if you haven't, you definitely want to set that up, and it can take up to 30 days to register and receive access. So check with your grants departments or whoever is in your agency who might be responsible for that, and make sure that they have that valid eval access and the number associated with that. So you are able to apply. They will not take late applications. So you want to kind of check off anything you can that might slow down the process as soon as possible. When it comes to fatality data, it was expressed to use data from FARS, if at all possible. So FARS is the fatality analysis reporting system. It is a database out of USDOT. When you're including serious injury information, your local data or CDOT data or DRCOG data is acceptable for that, but for the fatality data, they really want to have that number coming from VARs. And then one last note from that implementation grant webinar, I think that the reviewers or the presenters were trying to clarify some things that have been maybe said about the priorities in the NOFO. But they did say that adding bike lanes or facilities is not prohibited, but they expressed that it should not negatively impact level of service for motor vehicles. So that is just, that's what they said. That's something that this current administration and the priorities that's been given to reviewers are looking for in it. So it's not necessarily to say that you can't add bike lanes or something, but it should not lower level of service for a favorable review. As far as our plans for SS4A this year, we're not intending to do a call for projects or sort of semi-call for projects for a regional application as in previous years. We are coordinating with several of our local agencies and the Colorado Department of Transportation on implementing, hoping to implement some of the recommendations from the recently completed Sheridan Corridor Safety Study, as that study focused on Sheridan, which is a state highway, affects the study area we had affects 5 or 6 local agencies. So we thought it would be a really great project to look at for SS4A. But that said, we can support local applications if local agencies are looking to apply. There's a few ways that we are able to do that. One is after you've written your narrative, we're happy to take a look at it. We can't really develop the whole thing with you, but we are happy to read through it, see if it makes sense, make any suggestions based off of our experience, what we've heard from others. Just give it another glance of eyes. So please coordinate with us on that. As always, we're ready to supply relevant data as needed or requested. We do have the geospatial crash data that could be used for serious injury information on the application through the regional data catalog. And we do still have this underserved communities web map. We made this last year for the application. The criteria has remained the same, and I checked this and it appears to be the same as what they're looking for. So if you want to look at where your project areas might lie in this map, in this image on the right, the blue crosshatch is considered rural areas per the criteria of the NOFO, and this purple hatch are the areas of persistent poverty. So two of the areas that are considered for special consideration. And then finally, we are able to provide letters of support as requested. And the process for that would be really just reach out to myself or Catherine. If you could, please provide a draft letter of support that your agency would like us to complete. And especially if the project is on the regional high injury network that we currently have, that would be beneficial. We would provide you with, there's a form we have, it's the discretionary grant information form. It's the same as last year. Many of you are probably familiar with this, but it's just something that we ask our local agencies to fill out. It's more informational for us. It will go to our Transportation Advisory Committee for their, not for their review, or for their review, but not for their approval. But just something we like to do to keep track of what are the requests that are going out in the region. And after we've received that grant information form and your draft letter, we will just confirm that the project is consistent with our plans, including the Taking Action Regional Vision Zero and the Regional Transportation Plan. And we will provide your agency with a final version. It's a pretty quick process, but again, don't leave it till the end. If you have a project and you're working on it, if you can get that to us sooner rather than later so that we have time to review it and we have time to get it to our division director for approval. We don't want to hold up anything on your end by any process on our end. So the sooner you can get that to us for review, the better. And with that, I am happy to, I know we have coming towards the end of the full meeting, but I'm happy to take any questions or give any clarification on anything I've shared. And I don't see any hands up, and that's okay. So we are, again, I just want to reiterate, we're here to, provide support if that's requested for your application. And even if you don't have any questions at this moment, you please feel free to always feel free just to reach out to myself or Catherine, and we're happy to talk through any ideas and how we can support you in this process. And with that, I will conclude my screen sharing.
All right, we're just going to conclude the meeting with any local, regional, state, other news and updates that you think might be of interest to folks on this call. Let me see the screen. Anybody cool doing any cool things that they just want to give a shout out for?
Looks like Melody from CDOT.
Hi, good morning. So this is Melody from CDOT, and the Colorado Traffic Safety Summit registration just opened last week. I'll put the link in the chat. It's going to be held in Grand Junction, so I know it's a bit of travel for most of the people in this group, but that is on July 14th, 15th, and 16th. It's a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, so there's some time at the beginning and end of the week to travel. And yeah, it's going to be a great event this year.
Thanks, Melody. Looking forward to that. Anybody else? Yeah, Emily.
Hi, this is actually not quite Littleton work related, but it did make me want to shout out. I hosted an event in my spare time called Denver Bike Fest, and it's coming up on June 13th this year, and it's at York Street Yards. I'll put the website in the link, but it's a really fun place where it's just a collection of all the different types of bike communities, and frankly, it's kind of expanding to more than that now, and it's not just Denver, it's the Front Range. So if you're interested, or folks, or you want to share it with your communities, I encourage you to. We've got Way to Go there. CDOT's hopefully going to get registered soon. Dottie will be there with their Community Active Living Coalition, all that good stuff. So yeah, I will put a link in the chat and share it with Eric to share with the group afterwards as well. Thank you.
Thanks. All right, last call. With that, ending our meeting right on time for a change, which is great. So our next meeting will be June 9th. Hope to see you all then. It'll be another virtual meeting. So thank you all for attending and all of your input. All the input makes everything better. So thank you.